The Conservatives in the debate always use what's called the tax relief throne. That we want tax relief. That's how Conservatives discuss. Let's have tax cuts, tax relief. And what that invokes is a bad. We understand that taxes are bad and that we want relief from a bad. So that's an incredibly powerful frame to present to the public because it's reinforcing good overcoming bad.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our patrons so far. At the beginning there, you heard lead MMT academic Professor Bill Mitchell giving a talk in London about ways of introducing people to MMT. This is part 2 of that talk, and part 1 was last week. That's episode 35. In this part of the presentation, Professor Mitchell talks about the concept of framing and refers to the essential, in my opinion, insights of Professor George Lakoff. There's a link to Professor Lakoff's podcast that serves as a good introduction to him in the show notes. I've been interested in his work for a while, so I'll share some of the things I think I've learned from it. Professor Lakoff has a book, the title of which is a challenge that he sometimes puts to his students, and I'll put it to you now, and you can see how it works. You ready? Okay, here's what I want you to do. Don't think of an elephant. Of course, you're thinking of an elephant, because in order to be cognizant of what I just asked you to do, namely, to not think of an elephant, you have to think of an elephant. Because when I say elephant, you already have a concept of an elephant in your head that you've built up through your life. Your mental picture of an elephant might be different from mine, but we all have a concept of an elephant. These concepts are called frames, and when someone says elephant, your frame for elephant is activated, and that's why you end up thinking about an elephant even when someone says, don't think of an elephant. So, when we think about things from the most trivial to the most weighty, it activates multiple frames in our minds as we absorb communications from one another. So people generally think in metaphors rather than literally. And that's why when I said weighty rather than most consequential, you knew that I didn't mean issues that literally have mass and are literally heavy. From my understanding of his work, Professor Lakoff thinks that generally people who identify as left of centre or progressive think that to advance their arguments, all they need to do is just lay out the literal material facts of their argument, and people will reason to the same conclusion as them and come around to their way of thinking. And that's a blunder that costs progressive causes massively. And it's a blunder that conservatives don't make. Conservatives work very hard on their framing. They know that talking points are at their most potent when they are visceral. So they talk about death tax rather than estate tax, or they'll talk about job-killing regulation rather than planet-killing regulatory capture. And, as mentioned at the beginning, they talk about tax relief. We all have a frame for relief. Relieved means you're free of distress. It's a good thing. So the word preceding relief must be a bad thing that's necessitating relief. So if you hear people debating over and over again about tax relief in the media, no matter who wins each individual debate, the conservative framing does its work under the surface, and eventually the deeper message being conveyed sinks in, namely that taxes are bad. So that brings us to the function of taxes according to MMT. Even if you've never heard of MMT until now, I think it's not too controversial to say that when you think about it for 2 minutes, it's evident that a nation's currency is manufactured rather than dug out of the ground or plucked from a tree. So it follows that some entity has issued it. The UK government issues the British pound, the Canadian government issues the Canadian dollar, the Japanese government issues the Japanese yen, and so on. So it follows that taxes don't fund government spending at the national level. Governments issue new pounds or dollars or yen into existence when they spend. So why do governments tax their populations? As discussed in previous episodes, they do it to get the population to need their currency. Once demand for their currency has been created, taxes then function to regulate aggregate demand, which is a term for the number of pounds or dollars or yen circulating in the economy, and to incentivize behavior, taxing undesirable activities and giving tax breaks to activities the government wants to promote. So just to be clear, governments do not tax in order to collect revenue to pile up and then spend out again. This idea that taxes don't fund spending is quite hard for people to wrap their heads around because it doesn't sit well with our lived experience and the frames that are activated when we think about money. We have to earn or borrow or otherwise acquire money before we can spend it. And that's because we are currency users. The rules are totally different for currency issuers. And monetarily sovereign governments like the UK, the US, Japan, Australia, and Canada are currency issuers. They issue new currency into existence every time they spend and delete money from existence as far as the private sector is concerned every time they tax. This idea of taxes not funding spending is particularly hard to swallow for some of us on the left, because the way we frame it is that we work hard for our money, and even though we might be struggling, we give up some of our earnings to pay for public services that help everybody, especially people maybe less fortunate than ourselves, because we're social animals and we believe in pooling our resources to fund the public good. We care about people that we don't even know or are related to because that's the greater good as we see it. One day we'll be in a less fortunate position and people in a more fortunate position will be helping us out, and that's the kind of social values and worldview we have. And then we go on to think that if we could just get extremely rich people to pay their fair share, those less well off would be better provisioned. Now, I'm from the home of Robin Hood myself, so I'm particularly tuned into this. But the fact of the matter is that if the government needs to hire, say, 100,000 nurses or teachers urgently, the government can afford to buy anything available for sale in its currency without financial limit. When it spends, the government instructs its central bank, the Bank of England, to credit the relevant bank accounts using a computer keyboard. So, for the currency issuer, the limit to spending is a question of whether or not the real things you are trying to buy or hire exist or not. If those nurses or teachers exist, they can be afforded. Again, just to be clear, everything I've just said is not an argument for giving tax breaks to the already very wealthy. As Professor Mitchell himself has said in the past, I want to tax them out of existence. No, the point of an MMT understanding of taxation is to make the question of whether or not we can spend more on the NHS or schools or to solve unemployment irrelevant to whether or not we can raise taxes on the rich. So, for the Robin Hoods out there, maybe a way to reframe the issue of taxation, given this new understanding of money, might go like this. Given that taxation limits the spending power of the private sector, you, me, Richard Branson, Bill Gates, all of us, what would tax justice look like? Whose spending power should be limited the most and whose spending power should be limited the least? Now, that's not quite as snappy as robbing from the rich to give to the poor, but it is based on how money really works at the macro level, rather than the household analogy, which inevitably leads to the how you're going to pay for it framing, which inevitably leads to cutting public services. So, before we dive into Professor Mitchell's talk about framing, I'll just add, and this is just my take, I think that one of the underappreciated strengths of the way we can connect on the internet is that we can treat different people differently, and we can cut our cloth accordingly. The internet isn't a mass medium where we have to make average things and please no one in particular, and we make a mistake when we treat the internet like a mass medium. It's a micro medium, which means the things you make, your posts or your podcasts or videos about MMT, they don't have to be for millions. They can be bespoke for a small audience. In fact, the smaller that audience is, the easier it is to make something perfect for them. And the more perfect it is for them, the more likely they'll share it with people that they think it's perfect for, people they know and you don't. So it's just my take, but I think that's how truly engaged audiences grow for things like this. So if you're an MMT advocate out there and you made one person curious about MMT who wasn't curious yesterday, that's a productive day. If we all do that, and if the people who you inspire do that, our message will reach people exponentially. So thanks to the wonderful Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies for organising this event. There'll be a video of it available on the GIMS website soon, but maybe not immediately. I'll link to their YouTube channel in the show notes, where there'll also be a link to the slides from this talk and a link to free tickets for my MMT show that I'm doing in London on Tuesday, the 3rd of December 2019. This event was recorded in London on the 24th of September 2019. Here's Professor Mitchell.
So George Lakoff is a famous cognitive linguist, and he's probably done the most work on this, most influential academic researcher on this. And he has this thing called a truth sandwich. And he said that people who want to pursue progressive causes, because he's a progressive, but it works for anybody, you've got to think about the truth sandwich. And so you never start by attacking what you consider to be the lie. You never state the lie first. You always state, in entering an argument, you always state the truth. So the government can never run out of money. And then, once you've framed the discussion with the truth, you can then go back and discuss the attempt to divert the truth. So you can then talk about the mainstream in our context of economics. And then you always have to finish a discussion by returning to the truth, because you can never allow the diversion or distraction to work. So you sandwich the lie in between the truth. So when you're discussing things at your dinner tables or down in the pub, if you can get over the noise, or wherever, think about the truth sandwich. It's absolutely essential analytical device in framing and language. Because otherwise this is trying to address cognitive dissonance, otherwise you'll never get cut through. Now here's George. And a fundamental principle of the research that he's developed is denying a frame activates the frame. A frame is a conceptual structure by which we attach meaning to the world. It's the way we think we understand things. And if you try to deny a frame, you'll just activate it. This is the research literature. Now, what does that mean? Here's an example of negating a frame. And for those who are old enough will remember Watergate. And Richard Nixon on that date came out and gave at the height of the sort of attempt to derail him and impeach him. He was trying to defend in the last days of his defence. He made this address on TV, that was picture drawn, captured from the address, and at one stage he said, "I am not a crook." So the frame was that he was a crook, and he was trying to negate it, and all he did was reinforce the fact that everybody thought he was a crook.
What did he say to I am a crook?
So often we try to use negation of frames in our discussions, as I'll show you, and it's not the way to argue or to construct a discussion. So here's an example. progressives like to say no tax cuts for the rich. We don't want the rich to get tax cuts. And implicitly they believe, of course, that that'll reduce the amount of the capacity of government to do progressive things like public health and stuff. And all that no tax cuts for the rich, when they chant that at rallies and stuff, or progressive politicians go on TV and say, we don't want any tax cuts for the rich. We want them to pay their way. What that activates is that frame. No tax cuts for the rich just immediately activates in the way we understand things, the way the cognition works. It activates that frame. Now, what's the problem with that? Being rich is an aspiration. We all aspire, implicitly to be better off in material terms than we are now, because our society has that aspiration is our path to success, and that's the way typically we'll construct success. I'm not saying everybody thinks like this, but this would be a common sentiment. Now, what happens there? Well, the Conservatives in the debate always use what's called the tax relief throne. That we want tax relief. That's how Conservatives discuss. Let's have tax cuts, tax relief. And what that invokes is a bad. We understand that taxes are bad, and that we want relief from a bad. So that's an incredibly powerful frame to present to the public, because it's reinforcing good overcoming bad. And so you've got this messaging conflict. The left think that taxes permit spending on good things, so they say no tax cuts for the rich so the government will have more money. And the right say taxes take money from hard work and give it to those who don't work. And we want tax relief from that. And the reality is that both of those frames reinforce the Conservative frame, because of the progressives negate and therefore reinforce the frame that taxes are bad and we don't want them. They're an impingement to our aspirations. And the right say tax relief, getting rid of a bad. It's a really powerful demonstration of how you present your arguments. Negating a frame will reinforce it every time. Don't use language, don't use their language. So if you're trying to oppose something, you've got to break away from the language that's common to that they're using, because all you'll do is you'll pick out their frame. So what's an example for that? Hold on.
So could you say taxes don't pay for public spending?
Here's an example. So I'm doing an interview for Bloomberg or something, and or conservative media outlet, and they say to me, well, are you in favour of tax relief or not? Now, as soon as I say no, I reinforce the frame. So the way, and I'm using their language. So what I've got to do is divert it into different frames with different language. So when I'm asked by an interviewer all the time, am I in favour of tax relief? If I fall into the trap and say, well, no, I'm not really in favour of cutting taxes for the rich because they've got, because they've got too much money already, and all the rest of the sort of progressive motherhood sort of statements that Labor politicians use all the time. What I'll say, because I'm smart and I understand framing, is that I'll be asked that question and then I'll answer no. I'm in favour of the government having to provide first-class education and healthcare. I've diverted the frame. Now the frame is about government provision of good stuff, and I've taken it away from the arguments relating that to taxes. And you watch politicians being interviewed on current affairs programs and stuff, and you get so frustrated because they never answer the question. Well, that's because they know all this stuff. They're not going to get trapped into a frame that they don't want to. They want to create their own frame.
Yes, I'm wondering though, isn't even this answer isn't kind of reinforcing the message that the tax actually pays for those things indirectly? Isn't it kind of saying that the tax pays, that you're admitting that the tax pays for those things?
Yes. It's reinforcing all the things that frame invokes. That's a frame, tax relief. A good thing reducing a bad. And associated with that frame is all these propositions. The taxpayers fund government spending and all of this stuff. You're taking money off those who work hard and giving it to those who don't. All of the welfare sort of stuff. So you don't want to buy, as a progressive, you don't want to buy into any of that, because if you try to negate it, you'll just reinforce it.
I'm just thinking though that still, don't you want to explain that actually tax is not an issue in the provision of those things?
Yeah, but you do it by setting a different frame. So then you can start saying, well, the government can easily do that because it issues the currency and it doesn't have to tax and all this stuff. But you're dealing in this frame, not that frame. You're talking about the government doing good things, and the good things are not cutting taxes. They're providing hospitals and healthcare and aged care and.
Wouldn't it be? Sorry if this takes it off course a little bit, but couldn't you play into that frame and go, yeah, actually, I think the lowest income earners in this country do pay too much tax, and we should definitely cut taxes on them. So because you're dealing with that kind of person. It doesn't get us to the taxes don't fund spending thing.
Truth sandwich. You've got to have the first statements you make have to frame it in the way you want, and then you can go and talk about diversions, but don't buy into the language straight away. That's the argument. So for MMT, of course, this is the dissonance argument. We're up against a really powerful sets of frames that reinforce cognition. It's completely the opposite to the way MMT thinks. So that's our challenge, and that's why I'm doing this work. So here's a few further pointers in trying to redress or address that dissonance. You should never start an argument, this is again from the research literature, never start an argument with the facts. So you never go and say, oh, unemployment's sort of 13%, it's too high. It's factual, but it won't win the argument, because people will interpret that fact within their frame. So there's 13% of people who are too lazy to work. So you've lost the argument. So what you've got to start off with is what's called in this cognitive literature a destination. You've got to start framing your discussions initially in destinations, because we all love getting somewhere. I'm going to New York tomorrow. I'll be very happy when I get there. And so the destination that you start with should encapsulate our conceptions that we can all agree to, of social purpose and aspiration and all of that. And then you can start talking in terms of, well, what do we want the economy to do for us? how is the economy going to allow us to reach that destination? And the way in which you express the destination has to be in a way that triggers positive frames that you can then extrapolate to support your argument. That's very tricky. And then you can start talking about the facts, because then you can say, oh yeah, but we've got too many, we're not going to be able to achieve our destination because we haven't got enough people working. Rather than start bemoaning that you haven't got people working from the beginning and triggering all the negative stuff that we've been led to think about unemployment, laziness, not searching enough. You express that in terms of a failure to achieve a destination you establish as being desirable. And some years ago there was a group of mayors, cross-political, National Party and Labor Party, so normally wouldn't talk to each other, who were sick to death of the effect in their local areas of the austerity that the national government was pushing on to them as part of the whole neoliberal agenda. And they formed a Mayor's Task Force for Jobs. It was an unbelievably innovative venture and cooperation. And they had the grand purpose, zero waste of New Zealanders. It was a terrific social purpose. And it immediately framed their activities and everything they did in terms of zero waste. We love that. We don't want waste. And we certainly don't want our people wasted. And so then they could get down to discussions about facts and stuff. They also need, in this literature, there's a concept called event causation structures. So you actually have to link your destination to some events and some causation. And so here's an example of a broad destination, jobs for all. Now, unless you believe in UBI, then everybody likes jobs for all. But that's just an event, a destination. There's no causation in that statement. So a right winger can say, yeah, we want jobs for all, that's a great thing to achieve, but we'll do it by incentivising private markets and deregulating and getting more activity there, and cutting wages and getting everybody to be more incentivised. So that doesn't do it. You've got to attach a desirable causation to that, because this is their causation. Deregulation, privatisation. So your grand social purpose gets hijacked. So here's how you can progress there. You have to add an appropriate action that has a causation to it. And so here's an example. We want jobs for all. Everybody agrees with that. Which means that aggregate spending in the economy has to rise by X% to generate Y million jobs. So you've immediately got the broad social purpose frame attached to a causation structure, that we have to create jobs. Now, then you reinforce, then the causation structure becomes, you have to make that evident. How do you get that aggregate spending to generate the jobs? Well, you get it through government deficits. So you've got the purpose, the event creating the work, and the causation that will create the work, government spending above taxes, stimulus. So purpose, event, causation, action statements. And every time you frame a statement, you have to have those components in it. You can't just walk down the street, jobs for all, when do we want it? We want it now, that sort of stuff. That just reinforces frames that you don't want to reinforce. Okay, quickly. So some points on language. This is really the difficult part. Because, for example, in that previous example, we said, that we wanted the government to spend X million dollars to create whatever jobs we wanted for jobs for all. But that invokes, the term spent, for example, invokes negative frames. Because, in English language, spent means this morning I ran 10k and I was spent. I was tired because I'd been exercising, and so I'd left my glycogen in my muscles behind on the running track. I'd spent my energy. That's a bad thing. And so the alternative is that I might say government invested X million dollars, because this is an example we use these metaphors from the very early age. The cognitive linguists tell you that we have an embodied conception of mind and body in the way we understand reality. And we use metaphors that invoke physical as well as mental constructs as a way of creating meaning to our external world. So a really key metaphor we use, and you might be aware of it, but we're using it all the time, is this more is up metaphor. So we attach a quantity with a vertical distance, vertical direction. So if something's going up, we think that's more and that's good. If something's going down, we immediately think it's less and that's bad. And this is embedded in the research literature. It's a really powerful thing about our cognition. It's all subconscious. We don't know we're doing all of this, but that's what we're doing. And so invest is building up, more is up. We attach that to be a good thing, whereas spending is with the reverse of more is up, and that's something not very good. And the more is up works in reverse. And this is where it gets even trickier, because we might say that we need a larger deficit to accomplish the jobs for all. And so larger would typically be more is up, good. But the language then triggers the reverse of more is up, because more in this case is actually worse, because we're saying deficit, which is a shortfall. Really tricky. Yeah, works deficits we consider to be bad. It's a shortfall. We're running out. And the other reason I never use the word budget, unless I put it in inverted commas, is because it triggers the household metaphor. So in all my writing, you'll see mostly these days I never use the word budget deficit. I use fiscal deficit or fiscal balance, because it immediately triggers the budget, the household frame, which takes you down that path of no. You don't want to go there. And whenever you're talking about the more is up metaphor, and you're constructing it in an event structure that I talked about before, purpose, event, action, causality, destination, you always have to link the purposes that you're talking about with destinations. The destination must always be prominent, and you can modify our reaction to the more is up metaphor, the way that triggers our frames, by adding an appropriate destination. So for example, the government deficit rose, so that statement up to there would trigger the reverse more is up metaphor in our cognition. But then if you added a desirable destination and generated higher levels of wealth for households and firms, that's the way of dealing with that sort of cognitive trap. Yeah?
You have to use the deficit. You just say the government spending rose, generating higher levels of
Well, it says spending is the same as a deficit. It's a negative connotation. And so what this statement does, and this is the further principle that's in the literature, is the concept of forced movement. Okay, you establish a destination that you know that we want to get to that's desirable, and you've then got to relate that destination to something that's going to get you there. You won't get there unless there's a force operating to move you to there. And so in this context, the causes are forces and the causation are forced. And so in this case, the example we've given is that we want to disabuse people of thinking that things just happen, that the market does stuff, you know, that if we just leave it alone, it'll happen. And so in this case, we want to encourage people to understand that we need government action to actually force movement to our desired destination. And so our statements should be constructed to think in those terms. Yeah.
I often see on the left sometimes when they disagree with a particular type of government spending. For example, at the moment the government was using money for preparing for Brexit and issuing leaflets and things like that. They will use more than very negative framing in the sense they'll say the government is throwing this much money down the drain.
Yeah.
And I accept the fact that, you know, if you disagree with what the government is spending on, you have to make a case against it, but I do resent the way that they frame it.
Yeah, they use metaphors that invoke negative frames, like spending like a drunken sailor. If that's a metaphor, and so immediately we think of drunken sailors as these out-of-control characters that get off the boat in a port and go wild, drinking, womanising and all of the rest of the stuff that the movie industry's led us to believe about pirates and stuff. So yeah, I mean that's the point. I mean I was astounded that The Guardian, this guy Brian Partington, I think his name is, ran really negative articles when your current Chancellor said he was going to spend more money on national health and law and order to overcome the uncertainty that was building about Brexit. Well, why would you oppose that? And that it was going to lead to a dangerous fiscal situation where you'd have to then, in the future, have austerity to pay it all back. I mean, that's the progressive using such bad frames to just shoot themselves in the foot. They should have applauded that he was doing that, independent of your position on Brexit.
This is factionalism in that case.
I know.
Or use it to prove that the whole austerity narrative was
That's
wrong.
it.
Surely someone's got that money anyway. I mean, you're saying it's money being spent with a printer printing leaflets, but the printer's got the money, he's got a family, he's got a feed.
Yeah, one sector's spending is another's income. Yeah. Now, the debate might have been not that you needed to expand net government spending in Britain to overcome the uncertainty of Brexit. You certainly do need to do that, and you need to do much more spending in the short run than they're currently anticipating. And so, but the debate might have been on what social purpose was being achieved by that spending. That's where the debate should have been. But the progressives were killing the debate by saying, oh, it's dangerous to spend this at this point in time. There's so much Brexit uncertainty, the government might run out of money stuff. And it's just crazy stuff. Okay,
The Guardian is progressive, I think.
Right, and I understand that the centre has shifted to the right, but it's relative, isn't it? Okay, the last module, which I promised would finish in about 2 more minutes, and it's actually pretty easy to understand. This is some research we've been doing on social media use. And for anyone who knows me knows that I never get sucked into Twitter debates. There's constant baiting going on in the Twitter sphere, and I'm always getting these baits to buy in, don't ever do it. And the only reason I'm not on Facebook, I hate Facebook. The only reason I have a Twitter account and use it very thriftily is because I got sick of people at around about 4:30 in the afternoon sending me emails, about 50 emails, and then it got to 100. Where's your blog today? So I decided I'd get a Twitter account and hopefully educate people that when I send out a tweet, that's when the blog's written. And it's all different times depending where I am in the world. So here's some research, about 3 minutes. It's definitely not, and this is not my research, this is my understanding of the experts who have done research on this. It's not a debating medium. It's a really poor medium for debating. And so I see there's countless debates. There's one at the moment going on about UBI, and I just keep getting copied into them. It's just sickening. There's a phenomenon called compassion fatigue, and that is that we initially might be really concerned that there's poverty rising, but if we keep getting told about it, about bad things, we become inured to it. And so the message just becomes powerless. So if you think you're doing a good job out there by tweeting every day how bad austerity is, well then you're actually doing a bad job. You'll be invoking what's called compassion fatigue, and you may as well just not send the tweets. And what Twitter has been found to be suitable for is this it's extremely suitable for leading a reader to a preferred external source of information. That's what it's suitable for. But moreover, and this is the thing that really interested me when I sort of was reading all this literature, the next thing is really fantastic. Because if you learn to frame your tweet correctly, the tweet that refers a person to an external report or something, a bit of information, then you can actually, if you word the tweet properly, you can actually condition the way in which the person reads that report. You can frame them in a way that they'll read the report in a way that you want them to read it, in a sympathetic way. That's incredible in my view. And that's why the tweets have to be really worded carefully if you're wanting to refer a person to an external report. Because you can get the way that you can condition the way they receive that report. And so you could get a person who had views that were at odds with your views, and you refer them to an external report that reinforces your views, and you can get them to read that report in your frame, not their frame. And here's an example. So this is a typical tweet. You see, local community faces 10% unemployment. Parents cannot feed their children. Tories to blame. Compassion fatigue. Just washes off. It's wasted time. Whereas if you say economy needs more jobs, so you try to get the same message. The economy needs more jobs to bolster incomes and sales. Government stimulus created X million jobs during the GFC. See this article with a link. So they've already been framed to think that the government created the jobs, and that increased income and activity. Whereas this first one just washes away. The last slide is the difference between what are called structural and individual frames. And so whenever I talk, whenever I talk about unemployment, I always say it's a systemic shortage, a systemic failure of the economy to produce enough jobs. That's a structural statement. A systemic failure. It's the system failing, the economy to produce enough jobs. And that's juxtaposed with an individual frame. So for example, if you frame poverty structurally, then people assign responsibility to society at large. Whereas if you frame it individually, so often you'll see on TV or in the media case studies of a really disadvantaged single mum or something who's just lost their job, got 4 kids, poverty, hopeless situation. And while that might be very well meaning, it's framing the problem as an individual problem. And our cognition will be triggered to then assigning a responsibility of that person's state to them. Whereas that person's not poor because of them, that's not what you want people to believe. They might be, but that's not what you want people to think. But you've used an individual frame rather than a structural frame about poverty. Poverty is because there's not enough jobs in the economy, it's a systemic failure, and that's the solution to poverty. So it's got nothing to do with the individual particularly. Alright, so that's the end. Can I just say that GIMS are a really small group. They're the MMT group in Britain. There's MMT Scotland, there's MMT groups everywhere. This is the MMT group here. And they're a small group and they've got no resources and they really need help. So get behind them and join up with them, give them both labour support but other sorts of support because they're a terrific group. Thank you.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.